Hello, Ozie Cargile here with a quick video tutorial about the UlraMix plugin for Sibelius. I wrote this for all my fellow composers and music producers that are crazy enough to actually use Sibelius as something of a digital audio workstation, spending countless hours with the mixer faders trying to get the perfect sound for your symphonic mock-up or realization. This plugin is for you. It's going to allow you to do a lot of the things that you wish Sibelius could do, but hasn't been able to do just yet. Most notably, the ability to import and export your mix settings between multiple projects and perform some really precise bulk operations that's going to save you a lot of clicking on each of these little knobs here in the Sibelius interface. So let's get right to it. I have two scores. I'm going to first demonstrate how to import and export a mix. To do that, I'm going to really point out some things about the mix here for this project. This is actually a heroic score that I wrote some years back. Notice the woodwinds here are slightly below the horns. That's the point of reference that we're going to use here. And also notice that these are all kind of low and they're around the same volume range. That's because the VSTs behind this are pushing a lot of power, so I didn't really have to do a lot with the faders. But anyway, here's the sound. Alright, so that's just a demonstration there. We're going to contrast that to this score here called the Paid Piper, a clarinet concerto that I wrote for a little animation. Notice the faders here are a lot more contrasty. The VSTs are not doing as much in terms of power, so I really had to push them out to get the sound that I wanted. You can take a listen. Also notice that this score has a lot more instruments than the other. It's just a bigger score. Let's say I wanted to take this mix and bring it over to here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the plugin. Of course, this presumes that you've downloaded it and installed it. If you need help with installing plugins, please refer to the Sibelius documentation and the forums. I'm going to type Ultra, which will bring up UlraMix under Mix and Master. And there the plugin is there. The first thing I want to do is select the instruments I want to export. In this case, I'm going to select everything, but I could have just chosen to, for example, select just the strings so I can import just the string settings or just the woodwinds into, or any instrument combination into another project. But in this case, I want to select everything. I'm going to click on Export, find a folder on my computer, save it. It automatically saves with the file name .mix, and export is complete. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cancel out of this, which is actually a very important step. If you're moving between projects with this plugin, even though you do have different Sibelius files, there's only one plugin file, so you don't want it to get confused between the different mixer settings that it's caching. So it's always just a good idea to close it out in between projects and refresh it so that it'll load everything correctly. All right, I'm going to bring the plugin. Actually, I have a keyboard shortcut that I pre-programmed just so I could bring it up quickly. I have the plugin here, and I'm going to select everything, click on Import, find my folder, find my mix. Notice those woodwinds and horns over here. They are precisely what they are over here. And that pretty much works for all of the instruments in this particular score. Now, for the instruments that are not the same in the two scores, they just won't be affected. This really works based on the sound IDs within Sibelius. So the two instruments do not have the same sound ID. They will not, the mix will not transfer. So next I'm going to demonstrate, actually let me close out of this. You notice when I click cancel, it actually restores the mix to where it was before. Going back over here, I'm going to bring up the plugin and I'm going to demonstrate the fit faders to volume range. So let's say I selected everything and I want everything to be between 54 and 63 MIDI volume. That's on a scale from 0 to 127. notice what happens. It literally compresses everything here along the faders. And then let's say I wanted to scale that up, which is the next feature. I can scale everything up by 120%, which is essentially 20% greater according to their relative volumes, and click on adjust, and that adjustment is made. But notice the nuance between the mix is still there. The nuance between the faders, their relative distance from one another, is preserved even in, at this level of compression. I'm going to click on restore here to take the mix back to where it was when I opened the plugin and demonstrate this feature, scale faders relative to instruments. So my viola patch some of the articulations are much louder than the other string articulations. And so I find myself always mixing to the violas to balance them out first with other instruments in the orchestra, and then mix the strings relative to the violas. And it could be for any instrument that you're using. But let's say I want to keep the relative fader, the mix between a particular set of instruments relative to the one that I want to move. This is what that's for. Here, let me select all the strings, and I'm going to scale them so that the viola is precisely at 72, and then everything else is moved up relative to that. So it acts as sort of a master fader. You see that that section. But the cool thing is now you can create a master fader for any number, any combination of instruments that you have in your score. It doesn't have to be, dictated by the master fader over here. Which sometimes is a little hit and miss in terms of the instrument classes, in my opinion. All right, so let's restore here, and let's look at this other feature. I'm actually going to click Reset 2 to bring the plugin to its default settings. Let's look at the pan settings. So let's say I wanted all of my woodwinds to be panned to the left by 20 points. And this works on the scale from -100 to 100, with 0 being the midpoint. I can click on adjust, having selected those, and boom, you can see my little pan knobs have all been moved. And if you've ever tried to move these pan knobs in Sibelius, you know how much of a chore it can be to try to get an effect like this. But now watch this feature. I'm going to click on Invert Filter, which will invert my selection, and I'm going to click Set Pan to +20, click Adjust, and you'll notice now that all the faders, the pans for these faders have been moved over. And of course, the really cool thing is if I want to zero everything out, I can just click Set Pan to 0, and I don't have to go through adjusting each one of these individually. So that's a cool feature. I'm going to click Restore here to take us back to that original mix to demonstrate the Invert Mix feature. This is really interesting because it's kind of an experimental kind of thing. Basically what it does is it flips, the mix. And I will just show you here. I'm going to select everything and click on Invert Mix. Click Adjust, and you'll see that the highs became low and the lows became high. Like I said, this is an experimental kind of thing, but it can also have some very practical applications. If you just wanted to not invert the entire mix, but change the relative distance between two instruments or something like that in your mix. So that's something that you can experiment with. The next thing is include 0 volumes. Now, there are no 0 volumes in this right now. Let's create some. I'm going to play with the strings, scale them all down to 0%. So click Adjust, and as you can see, they've all been flattened there. Normally, when I have instruments that are at 0 volume, it is because the Sibelius mixer isn't communicating with the VST to actually affect the volume. So I just essentially zero it out so that I know not to mess with it. Let's say I wanted to fit my mix back into that narrow 54 to 63 range. Selected everything, and as you can see, it was adjusted, but the 0 volume was not adjusted. So I'm going to click Undo, take us back, and then I'm going to click on Include 0 volumes and click Adjust again. And now you see it brings those strings up. Again, this is very narrow, so you see everything's kind of squashed. But you can imagine the value of this if you needed to move those 0 volumes, and bring them into the mix. And of course, it's doing everything relative. So this nuance mix isn't the same as if those volumes were not included, because the plugin is basically trying to maintain the relative distance while also fitting them into a particular range. Going back to the original mix here, I'm going to demonstrate the last feature, which is filter volumes. So let's say I wanted to filter all the volumes that are greater than MIDI value 72 and scale them down 50%. Okay, watch here in this particular section because this is where some of the higher volumes are. I'm going to click adjust and you can see now that those faders moved. If I click undo, click invert filter, and select one instrument because of course it's going to invert my selection. I need to have at least one instrument. And now what this is going to do is going to find all of the volumes that are less than 72 and scale them down by 50%. And you can see that's exactly what it has done. So it's a complicated plugin. It's got some complicated things that you can do. But I mean, it's pretty straightforward if you just want to import and export your mix. Or play around with different settings without the risk of, losing your mix, because it saves copies of the mix as you're going through. And of course, like I said, you can click on restore to get that back. If you click on cancel, it will cancel out and restore your previous mix. And if you click on exit, it will exit out with the changes saved. So that's pretty much it. That is the UlraMix plugin. I'd love to get your feedback. Do download it. Tell me what you think. All that information on how to get it and reach me will be in the description for this video. I hope this is as good to you as it has been to me. I've been using it for a number of years actually, and I've just now decided to release it to the world. So do enjoy it, and that's everything there. I'll see you in the future.